Gillian Slovo was born to activist parents in apartheid South Africa. Since moved to London, England, Gillian has written several crime novels and a new novel called Black Orchids, which was published earlier this autumn. Good morning, Gillian.
Morning.
Growing up in apartheid South Africa is obviously a huge challenge for everybody. Growing up with activist parents, your parents were very politically involved. Maybe you could describe what that setting was like for you growing up.
Well, I spent my first 12 years in South Africa, and I lived a schizophrenic kind of existence. In one sense, I lived an ordinary white life. I went to a whites-only school because that's all you could do. I was ferried to and fro by car. And I seemed to be like any other white kid, except the fact that my parents were so politically involved meant that also at home I had a completely different environment. I had an environment where black people would come not just to wash the dishes or make the beds, which is what most white South Africans had, but as friends of my parents. My parents used to hold the most fantastic parties, and part of the party would always be the police storming in, trying to find blacks and whites drinking together, which was against the law. So I got brought up thinking that in an adult party what happens is that halfway through suddenly everybody started throwing their liquor into the very many vases my mother kept in order not to be caught.
When you then moved to London, was it a complete culture shock right away, or was it a transition into maybe something that was an in-between stage because
There was some relief in leaving South Africa because the last year that I had spent in South Africa was very, very difficult. It was when all the leaders of the opposition were picked up, and my father was out of the country, but my mother was actually picked up and held in solitary detention for 117 days. So my vision of what had happened is that everybody had disappeared out of my life. My father disappeared, my mother was in prison, my grandma was continually going between prison and home, and my grandfather also disappeared. And the first thing I knew that he had gone was I saw a wanted advert in the papers. So there was a tremendous relief of getting to England. But at the same time, I was a voracious reader as a kid. We didn't have television in South Africa then. And what I'd read about England was the English classics, Jane Austen and Charles Dickens, and I expected there to be carriages rolling across cobbled streets, and it didn't look like that at all.
So you're expecting the pastoral,
I was expecting good oldie England, and what I got was modern London.
So what was modern London then? Because this book is set in I guess London before that period, but London in the 50s. Now what did that transition to moving into modern London influence what you wrote in this book? Because the tale is an interracial marriage brought from Ceylon to London. Maybe the characters expected something of what you had expected, had different perceptions of what that London might be like, and when they got there, maybe it was a bit different. Did that play into what you wrote?
I guess it did, although this is a very different... I'm a fiction writer, and this is a very different kind of family than the one I came from. But in the book Black Orchids, the woman of the couple is English-born. Her parents... English in family. Her parents were born in in England, but she had never been there. But she comes to an England that she expects is going to recognize her as one of them. But in fact, she comes from such a different culture that what she discovers is this isn't the fantasy of the England that she expected. Perhaps she also expected the rural idyll, and also that her husband, who was ruling class Sinhalese back in the country that they had both been born in, coming to England is just any old black man. Even though he has a lot of money, he is considered black. So it's that shock of transition. I guess I drew in a way on the emotions of the shock of my transition, but it is also a different story.
Sure. Now, how did you research that period of time? Because it's a very specific experience in a very specific point of time. What was your research like for that?
I read a lot of books about England in the 50s. I try to look for diaries, because diaries give you a much better view of what was actually happening. You know, and if you read enough, what you find out is, for example, there are certain things about the 50s that are very different from the way we live today. And one of them is, in England in the 50s, there was always wash day. And Monday was wash day, which meant that Monday and Tuesday, every house would be fogged up. There's no central heating. There's a very cold and foggy environment anyway, because they hadn't had air pollution controls. And, you know, so that you'd go into a house and you'd get steam rising from the clothes that are drying in front of the fire. There are things like that that I think give authenticity to what it's like. But mainly, I'm a fiction writer, and I have give myself permission to make it up as well. And I think if you hit a truth in the story and a truth in the times, you will make up stuff that turns out to be true anyway.
Okay. Well, maybe we could hear some of the fiction meeting truth now, if you could be so kind as to do a reading for us.
Well, this is through Evelyn, who is the woman of the family, coming, and it's her first arrival in England, and her husband is called Emile. As Emile drove to their new home that he promised would astound, she watched what seemed to be an unending dilapidation and decay passing by. A dulled landscape was drawn in greys and dingy reds over which man had heaped his own defeats. Jangled telephone wires and electric cables littering unkempt but tarred streets. Kerchiefed women scrubbing warily at dingy front steps that would never come clean. Bruised-kneed children playing in the rubble of houses long since destroyed, while adults, grey-skinned, scurried with lowered heads past the bombed-out buildings. It was so ugly.